Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Kate Santos, and I'm the Associate Vice President of the Science Division here at Longwood Gardens. It is my sincere pleasure to welcome you to Longwood Gardens and our April Science Series presentation on seeds and seed science. For those of you who are returning visitors, thank you for your continued support and interest in our science program. For those of you who are here for the first time, thank you for taking the time out of your day here at the Gardens to learn more about some of the work that goes on behind the scenes. At Longwood Gardens, our science team not only creates and shares the often fragile beauty of nature, we also work very hard to protect it. Our work in seed science helps conserve rare and endangered plants around the world with far-reaching efforts. Our speaker today is Dr. Peter Zale, Associate Director of Conservation, Horticulture, and Plant Breeding. Peter plays an integral role in leading the work that we do here on seed conservation. Today he will share how the conservation efforts we do here take place in our laboratories, in our greenhouses, the fields and forests of Pennsylvania, and remote regions around the world. Along the way, you'll discover how we build upon our own collections and advance conservation on a global scale. Keeping in mind, much of this work begins with the often tiny yet formidable seed. Please welcome Dr. Peter Zale.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm glad to see you here. It shaped up to be quite a nice day. So I know, like many of you, I'd probably rather be out in the garden, but I'm going to talk to you today about a subject that's very near and dear to me, and that is the subject of seeds and seed science. So I thought it would be fun as we get started. I have a lot to cover, so I'm going to go relatively quickly and talk about a lot of things. We'll save questions until the end, but I thought it would be nice to start with some facts about seeds. I spend a lot of time thinking about seeds, right? Seeds are diverse, seeds are variable, lots of different things about seeds, but did you ever think about what the largest seed might be, or what the smallest seed might be? And it just so happens that the largest seed, as you can read there, is the seed of a palm, the coco de mer, which is sometimes called the double coconut. And it is, as you can see up there, quite large, right? We think of a close second would be the actual coconut or Cocos nucifera, the coconut that we eat that's distributed all around the tropics. The smallest seed is actually the seed of this plant, Nectocylus imitans, which is a type of orchid. And I'm going to talk a lot today about orchids and orchid seeds because they all have these tiny dust-like seeds. In the case of the one that I have mentioned here, the seeds are so small you can't actually even see them, okay? So really quite fascinating seed sizes. And it turns out that buckeyes, I went to the Ohio State University. I love to bring that up, especially here in Pennsylvania. I work with a lot of Penn State grads. It turns out that the buckeye has some of the largest seeds of any temperate plant species in the world. And so we have these really unique experiences and opportunities to see seeds right here in our own backyard and here at Longwood Gardens. It turns out that seeds are incredibly diverse, and if you're a gardener like me and you're just generally interested in plants, you know, we often think of plants for the beauty of their flowers or their bark or their leaves or other things, but many plants have very beautiful seeds, and you can see many different types of plants up here on the screen. My favorite are the peonies, the red and blue ones that you sort of see in the center there, which again is an often unknown characteristic of these plants that have merit in the garden. I think one thing we might not often think about when it comes to seeds is how long they can last. And so I did a little quick research, and you can easily find this online, but it turns out that the oldest seeds to still be viable were 32,000 years old. And you can see a picture of the plant, Silene stenophylla, in the image there that was grown from 32,000-year-old seeds that were unearthed from the Russian permafrost some years ago. More recently, you might have heard of Phoenix dactylifera, a type of date palm, in which they were able to get seeds out of an excavation site, an archaeological excavation site, and found that the seeds were still viable after 2,000 years. And in the case of this type of palm, it turned out to be a species that was no longer found in the places where it used to be found. So actually, our species was resurrected through these ancient seeds. And it turns out that many seeds are often quite long-lived. We often buy packets of seed from Lowe's. We have vegetable garden seeds. They have an expiration date on them. You can completely ignore that. If you keep your seeds in the right conditions, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, they'll often last for years, 5 years, 10 years. Some seeds can last easily for a century or more. So I'm going to talk about what we do with seeds and sort of our science program here at Longwood. So right behind the conservatory here, we have a laboratory. We have various laboratories. We do science. We work on problems that occur here in the gardens. We work on problems that involve conserving plants in the wild here in Pennsylvania and around the world. So seed science and seed banking, which I'm going to talk about quite a bit, are really important to Longwood. And if you look across the gardens, we interact with and use seeds in many different ways. And so you can see all these things listed here. Plant exploration. Last week I was in Uzbekistan, of all places, looking at tulips in the wild and signing an agreement to work with the Central Asian countries to help them conserve their flora. And in the market in Tashkent, we came across this incredible seed cellar you can see in the image. So plant exploration, we often go to the wild to find plants, but sometimes we find them in places we should expect or maybe didn't expect, like in the markets. We use seeds to promote displays that you see out in the conservatories. Our idea garden, where the vegetable garden, they save seeds to keep some of those things going. We use seeds to help restore all the natural areas at Longwoods. We use seeds for conservation horticulture, working with the seeds of rare plants to propagate them and help them persist not only here at Longwood, but in the wild as well. And one thing I'm going to talk about today, we recently acquired a grant that is going to allow us to do conservation seed banking. So you might think about Svalbard, this seed bank that's up in up in Norway or Sweden or wherever it is in the Arctic Circle, where they're conserving the world's crop diversity. And so we want to do something like that, not on that scale, but we want to do something like that where we're helping conserve plants here in Pennsylvania and the plants that we work with through our plant exploration program. So we get to go out and see all kinds of interesting plants. You know, there's 250,000 tulips flowering at Longwood right now, and that's incredible, right? But it's interesting to think about where plants come in the wild. So part of the reason I went to Uzbekistan was to see wild tulips. And this one, Tulipa fosteriana, absolutely incredible to see it in the wild. We'd love to grow this one day at Longwood, perhaps. What are we going to do? We're going to go back and we're going to collect seeds, right? So tulips are another group of plants. You can grow them from seed, and the seeds will often last for quite a long time. We use seeds to bring new plants to the garden, and one from my garden that I'm really excited about is this poppy called Papaver macrostomum black magic, and those are not altered images. I don't know how they look up there on the screen, but this is a truly black flower. And this is not a perennial poppy like Papaver orientale that you might be growing in your garden. This is a poppy that needs to be renewed from seed every year. So hopefully this is one we can put on display sometime in the future so you can come and see it for yourself. So thinking about what we do in science, plant exploration, traveling the world, bringing back new plants, working on plant conservation here in Pennsylvania and other places around the world, very important to what's happening for our program and here at the gardens. And so if you look at this sort of wheel of activities here, you can see seed collection is a big part of that. So when we go out and collect plants in places like those tulips, we might be able to collect some bulbs depending on our relationship, you know, or the agreement that we might have with that country. But ultimately what we want are the seeds, right? And the seeds help us not only grow, you know, and have that plant, but have a genetically diverse population of that plant, many different types. And that's how you find variants. You know, maybe one of those tulips is yellow flowered. Maybe one of them has more orange flowers. Maybe one is taller. Maybe one is shorter. So the diversity within the seeds is really important. And in many cases, we go out and collect seeds. We don't know anything about them. You might not know how to germinate them. You might not know how long they store. There's all these considerations that go into just propagating and getting the seeds to germinate. So we do a lot of work to figure out how to do that, especially with more unusual plants. So all of this is linked to plant exploration. And if you came to my talk about Tanzania, or maybe some of my other talks, I showed this in the past. And the last talks were focused on these exotic places that Longwood staff have gone to over the last 60 years. But one of the things we've worked on a lot over the past 10 years or so is working right here in the United States with our native plants. And that was something that really hadn't been happening at Longwood for a long time. So I'm going to focus on our work with native plants and how we use seeds to really fuel that research. So we do basic things. We collect seeds, we figure out how to germinate seeds, and then we bank seeds. The idea that we can take a sample of seeds, put it into storage, and it will be there for safekeeping down the road. And so these are three major things that I'm going to talk about. And within those three major things, I want to talk about some different research projects that we've been working on. You may not know, or maybe you do know, that Pennsylvania is home to about 60 species of orchids, or 60 different type of orchids. And so most people think of orchids as growing in the tropics, on tree limbs, or that phalaenopsis that you have on your windowsill at home. But we have our own orchids here. And many of them are symbols for conservation, right? The places where they grow in Pennsylvania are often the most pristine habitats that we have left in the state. And so they really are symbols for plant conservation. We're also working on other endangered plants in Pennsylvania, and I'll get into this. And then all of this is funneling into this conservation seed banking, and I'm going to dive into this further as I go. So a little bit about seeds. Not all seeds are created equally. There's basically two kinds of seeds, orthodox and recalcitrant. About 85% of the seeds on the planet are like the seeds you buy at Lowe's or wherever, you know, a packet of dry seeds. They can be dried down to very low moisture content. About 15% of seeds on the earth can't be dried. And so we think of things like oak trees or beech trees or hickories. These have seeds that have a very short shelf life. So if you don't sow them or work with them, they can't be banked. And so those plants are often grown as living collections, okay? So we actually have the plants. And so two very different types of seeds. And then seeds have dormancy, all right? When you buy a packet of seeds, they're dormant, right? And then you give them different treatments. You might give them water, you know, light, warmth, these different things. That causes the seeds to break dormancy and start to grow. Some seeds have very complicated dormancy factors, and they require a number of different environmental cues or interaction with other organisms like fungi in order for them to germinate. Okay, and then we have what are called exceptional species. And this is a term that we use in the public garden world to talk about plants that need to be propagated by not just taking the seeds and putting them in a pot and, you know, keeping them warm. They might need to be grown in a lab, they might need to be put in the cold, they might need to be stored, they might need to be sowed right away. I mean, there's all these different factors. If you're really interested in seeds, the book that I have pictured there by Jerry and Carol Baskin, who are sort of two gurus of the academic seed world, they created this textbook. And I'm telling you, it's probably more than you ever want to know about seeds, but it really does a good job explaining the basics of seed science and why plants have seeds that require the treatments that they have. Okay, so just a little plug for that. So I'm going to talk about our research projects. First, I'm going to talk about orchids, okay? And so we all know orchids as they grow in the orchid house. Well, it turns out that orchids are exceptional species. They all have these tiny dust-like seeds. I already mentioned in the first slide the one orchid that has seeds so small you can't even see them. Most orchids have seeds between 6 millimeters and 0.05 millimeters in length. So they are literally like dust. And I can tell you this because in my office back here, we clean the seeds. If you accidentally sneeze or if you breathe a little bit too hard, they just float away. And so probably in my office, there are probably millions of orchid seeds in the atmosphere just sort of floating around. But this very small size makes them difficult to work with. For most orchids, the vast majority of them, you couldn't just sprinkle the seeds on a pot and get them to grow. You need to use specific laboratory conditions to get them to go. In the wild, all of this is done by mycorrhizal fungi, right? So there's all these fungi that live in mosses and soil and leaf litter and things like that. And the orchid seed not only needs to land in the right place to germinate, but the right fungus needs to be there too. And the seed interacts with the fungi, and that orchid actually uses farms the fungus in its cells and uses it as a food source. So orchids are actually all parasitizing fungi. We often think about that the other way around, right? Fungi are attacking our plants. In this case, orchids are actually using the fungi. So they're really odd plants, right? You think about their unusual flowers, their unusual growth forms, all the diversity, but from the standpoint of their seeds and seed germination, they're really quite unusual. So to give you a little background, about 10 years ago, Longwood entered the world of plant conservation. And we wanted to, most public gardens around the world are working in plant conservation, right? The idea that gardens are sort of an ark of sorts to hold plant diversity and protect it against threats that might be happening in the wild. And so our founders, Pierre and Alice DuPont, were very interested in orchids. They built the conservatories in large part, I think, to house a collection of orchids. And orchids have been one of our collections of plants here for the last 100 years or so. But we know from a project that we did that some of the first orchids that they bought were native orchids. The one in the image here, Gallier spectabilis, is called the showy orchis, was one of the first orchids they ever bought. It probably was dug out of the wild, and it probably died almost right away. Turns out this orchid is actually native here on the property, but keeping this fact in mind and knowing that orchids are really important to Longwood, we started our conservation program to really focus on how to grow native orchids. And so all of this work is based on seed collection, seed germination research, and seed banking. And to give you an idea of what some of our orchids look like, some of them are really showy, some of them are really beautiful, others are not so much. But like I said, wherever orchids occur in the wild, they are symbols for ecosystem purity. And so you know if you see an orchid in the wild, you're in a very special place. And this is a little bit of what we do here. Any of the plant collecting we do, when we're out getting seeds, whether it's here in Pennsylvania or around the world, all of it is based on partnerships and collaborations with people that are able to give us permission to do this kind of work. This is all done through plant exploration. We travel across Pennsylvania, we collect seeds from here in Chester County, from Bedford County, wherever. So we're collecting the seeds, and then we bring the seeds back to our lab, and we learn how to germinate and grow them. And so you can see in the image, there's what orchid seeds look like. A 1.5 milliliter vial, like you see there, can literally hold thousands and thousands of orchid seeds. And then we bring them into our lab, and under sterile conditions, we learn exactly what they need to grow them. And so all of this is based on seeds. And so we're focusing on native orchids, and one of the reasons that we did this is that many of our native orchids have seeds that are very difficult to germinate. In fact, for some of them, like the lady slipper orchid, it wasn't really figured out until about 25 years ago exactly how to do it. And so what we're attempting to do is to develop a database on how to germinate all of our native orchids. And we're working towards this hopefully by 2030 so that people that are interested in this kind of work, whether they're nursery people or they work at other public gardens or they're conservation officers, we're able to give them this information to help them along. And so what does a seed bank look like for orchids? Basically, in a 5x5 box like you see here, we can keep about 80 samples of orchids. Because they're so small, they're ideal for banking. We can keep a lot of samples in a really small place. And so over the last 10 years or so, we've accumulated a seed bank that's had as many as 900 seed samples in it. And I really tried to find images to show what this looks like, but literally it just looks like a bunch of boxes in a cooler and then a spreadsheet to go along with it. But you get the idea. It's a lot of different kinds of seeds. And so one of the things we found with orchids is that we don't treat them all the same. And in some cases, with our native orchids, they don't often set seeds on their own. So what we found working with various orchids across the state is that if we want to get seeds, we actually have to hand pollinate them, okay? Because the pollinators that might be there either can't find them, they're not there, different things like that. We've also found that some orchids, I mentioned dormancy, right? If you were to harvest the seeds when they would normally be mature in the wild, so for something like a lady slipper here, which would be in September or October, they enter this dormancy that it's very hard to get them out of. And so what we found was, through a horticultural hack, that if you harvest the seeds at about 50 days after pollination and take them into the lab and give them what they need, they actually germinate a lot better than if you harvest them when they would normally be dispersing into the wild. And so thinking not only about, what seeds we need to collect, but when we need to collect them is very important, and it can make a big difference in learning how to propagate these things. So the yellow lady slipper that you see here was one of the first species we started working on. And this gives a bit of an indicator of what it's like. So we hand pollinate the flowers in May, we harvest the seeds in June, we put them into petri dishes or jars with the right substrate under sterile conditions in our lab, and they often germinate within about a month. And then about 6 months, 5-6 months after that, they're ready to be transferred. And so part of what we do is once you get something to germinate, you have to figure out how to keep it growing. So we move them into test tubes. After another 10 months or so, they're ready to come out. And we sort of unceremoniously take them out of these test tubes. And temperate orchids, unlike tropical orchids, they need cold to grow. So we take them out of this nice sterile test tube, we plop them in a plastic bag with a little bit of water, and we stick them in the cooler for 30 days, because without that cold, they can't grow. And then once you get them to that phase, you're almost, a year and a half, 2 years in, you get the first shoot. Okay? So this is very time consuming. And if you've ever bought orchids for your garden, you think, why are they $50? Why are they $100? Because I'm telling you, to get to something like this takes another 10 years probably. So they're already pretty old, right? But what's an interesting fact about lady slippers, if you see them in the wild in places like this is up in Berks County, there were some studies done on some European lady slipper orchids that estimated the generation times to be 100 to 400 years. So these things are incredibly long-lived in the wild. So this is where it's an interesting sort of, we can store the seeds of some things and they last for a long time, but we also know some plants are extremely long-lived as well. So we do a lot of work with all kinds of lady slipper orchids. If you're interested in seeing them, you can see yellow lady slipper, probably not quite in bloom yet, over in the Hillside Garden here at Longwood, a 1963 accession, so that means the same plants have been here at Longwood for 60 plus years. If you come back around May 20th, you can see this one, the Kentucky lady slipper orchid, which is the rarest lady slipper orchid that we have native to the US. It's declining in the wild, but it also turns out to be one of the easiest to grow. And we have nice big stand of this over in Pierce's Woods, right next to Pierce's LA. It's worth coming back just to see that. So a lot of what we do is seed-based. We're figuring out how to propagate the seeds. We're doing research to figure out how to do that. But what we want to know more about now is how to bank orchid seeds, right? If we take those seeds and we're just going to say, we're going to keep these seeds in our cooler, how long will they last? And that's what we want to know, because not all seeds last the same amount of time. Orchidaceae is the largest family of flowering plants in the world, at least 24,000 species. Most people estimate more than 30,000 species. That means they account for up to 10% of all the plants on the planet, right? That's pretty significant. And everywhere they grow, they are the canary in the coal mine. They are the symbols for ecosystem purity. And so they're really important in that regard. So what we want to know is how to bank orchid seeds. We already know from what we've done, some last a few months or maybe 6 months. Some, like lady slippers, last at least 10 years and counting. And so we want to know more about this. So we're going to be doing more and more experimentation to learn about this, ultimately to help conserve plants in the wild, but also to help build things like our orchid display as well. I'm going to switch gears and I'm going to talk a little bit about some other projects. We're doing other work in Pennsylvania to help conserve rare species. And we work a lot on what we call S1 species. So there's a ranking system, S1 to S5, and S1 are our rarest plants in Pennsylvania. And usually there's 7 or fewer populations. of that. This particular plant, Polemonium van Bruntii, is one of the plants in Pennsylvania that's really quite rare, and not much was known about it. So we started working with the Pennsylvania Plant Conservation Alliance to help conserve this species. And what we know is most of the populations are very small. Like our gardens, which are impacted by white-tailed deer, many plants in the wild are also impacted by deer as well, particularly this species. And so we set out to learn more about it. So we went out, we collected a whole bunch of seeds, and what we wanted to learn were some of the things I talked about. Do they have desiccation-tolerant seeds? How do we learn more about them? How do you germinate the seeds? And so things like this are perfect intern projects, all right? We have interns that come through Longwood all the time. They want to learn more about plants and more about propagation, things like that. And so this is a perfect project for them. So we did a replicated study in germination boxes, as you see there. This is what that looks like. Nothing too exciting, but what resulted was really exciting. What we basically learned was that these seeds have what's called non-deep physiological dormancy. Well, what does that mean? It means they need a little bit of cold in order to germinate. So you put them on those blue blotter papers, keep them in those boxes in the cooler for about 30 days, bring them out, they germinate like crazy. Okay? It turned out that this was actually a really easy plant to grow, and it's interesting how some of these plants that are really rare in the wild actually make really good garden subjects. And so we actually ended up with hundreds of seedlings, as you can see in the images there, and we took those seedlings and we actually did a restoration project. We went back to the place where we harvested the seed, we took the seedlings with us, and we planted them back into the wild. So we took 100 of them, we planted them out, and what we want to learn is this a way we can help conserve plants? Does it help? Like, can you take a plant that was grown in cultivation and plant it back out and be successful in helping that species persist there? So we're learning more about what are the best practices for that. And we have other projects like this set up with other species here in PA. This work also takes us to some of the most beautiful places we have left in Pennsylvania. This is Serendipity Swamp, where we replanted these particular polemoniums back out into the wild. So it'll be exciting this year to go back there and see how the plants we put out last year have performed. Part of this work is also is ongoing. We're trying to propagate and store seeds of all of the populations of this plant left in Pennsylvania. Because we had so many seedlings, we were able to give seedlings to other public gardens, Jenkins Arboretum, Stoneleigh up in, on the main line, Powder Mill Nature Reserve out in western PA. So we're getting these plants not only in the seed bank in our gardens, but in other gardens as well. And again, this species is important to us because it's really sort of where we started with this kind of work, and it's still going. We're propagating this from Ricketts Glen, and ultimately we're hoping to be able to bank seeds and put seedlings back out into all of the places where it currently occurs. So I know I'm running short on time. I still have a few more slides left here, so I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. So all of this is feeding into this new initiative that we have here at Longwood to bank seeds. And really, banking seeds is a simple way to make a big impact in the world of conservation. You can put a lot of seeds in a relatively small space. And as I mentioned, most seeds can be dried and stored for a long time. There are no seed banks in Pennsylvania. There are seed banks in most of the states around the country, but none here in PA. And the partners we work with here in Pennsylvania recognize this is a huge shortcoming. And so we are working with them, and we received a grant. We're going to be doing more and more seed banking and learning about our native plants here in Pennsylvania. And so I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but we actually have about 2,000 different kinds of native plants here in Pennsylvania. About 20% or so are listed, which means that they're rare or threatened or endangered in some way. It means that people are paying attention to them. And it turns out that 31 of these species globally are vulnerable, right? There's not that many populations in the world. 31 species are extirpated. So that means 31 species of plants historically were found here in Pennsylvania are now extinct from the state. That's what extirpated means. And so we're recognizing that our flora that we have here is not static. It's dynamic and it changes all the time, and some species come and go. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, it's human activity that has really been driving these events. And so we feel like working with this information and seed banking is a way we can help mitigate some of that. And did you know there's one endemic species in Pennsylvania, right? Endemic means it only occurs in one place. So we have one species here that only occurs in Pennsylvania and nowhere else in the world. Maybe you've seen it. It's called the very hairy chickweed, okay? There's a hairy chickweed, all right, which grows all around it, and then there's the very hairy chickweed that grows in this one place along the Octorero Creek right here in Chester County out in William Penn State Forest. And so it's actually quite an ornamental plant, and if you're a gardener, and you hear chickweed, that usually means you're talking about something that you're pulling out, right, because they're very weedy. But this is one that's very, very rare, and so we're working with this species not only in how to grow it, but also how to store its seeds as well. And we work, I've mentioned our partners, we collaborate with many people. The Pennsylvania Plant Conservation Alliance, which is housed in the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, is one of our main partners. And we work together on these S1, so these state rare and globally vulnerable or globally rare plants. And you can see a list of them there. One of them happens to be the Cates Mountain clover that you see in the photo there, and here are some of the others as well. And it's interesting with these, these are pictures of them in the wild. And what, oftentimes when you bring plants into cultivation, they almost take on a new life, right? They can grow more luxuriantly or bigger or have more flowers than they often do in the wild. So, some of these things look like, well, I don't know about that. Those plants might not look very Longwood, but once we bring them back into the garden, we learn how to germinate the seeds, we bank the seeds, we get them growing, we might find that these are plants that you could see on display here at Longwood, whether they be in Pierce's Woods or in our natural areas or things like that. So how do you bank seeds? Again, orthodox versus recalcitrant seeds. You can only bank seeds that can be dried. And generally, you bank seeds in two ways. For short term, you keep them at low temperature, low humidity, okay? Generally, what they say is when you add your temperature in Fahrenheit plus the relative humidity, that number should be less than 100. Okay, if you are storing seeds long term, it's preferable for a lot of them to be frozen. And if you didn't know it, our government, the USDA, has what's called the National Plant Germplasm System. There's about 30 germplasm centers. I did my Ph.D. at one in Columbus, Ohio, the Ornamental Plant Germplasm Center. And this is a series of seed banks that are set up all around the country to conserve different kinds of plants. The image here that you see is the one in Ames, Iowa, where you guessed it, they're conserving corn, okay? And they have 35,000 different kinds of corn there. And you know what? These resources are freely available to you through GRIN, which is the Global Resources Information Network. Your tax dollars at work right here supporting all of these gene banks and seed banks around the country. Okay, so we're going to establish a seed bank here. A little bit about it. It's not big, 84 cubic square feet. We're working on 10 species initially, but this gives us capacity to store almost 20,000 packets of seeds, and if we really packed it out, over 100,000 samples of orchid seeds. Now that could take many careers worth of work to accomplish, okay? That's not going to happen overnight, but the idea is that we're getting set up to really be able to store a lot of diversity in a small space for a long time. Part of the work that goes along with banking is, like I mentioned, how do you germinate seeds? For some things, like Taenidia montana, pictured in the image here, essentially nothing is known about it. When do you collect the seeds? Can you dry them? Do they need to stay moist? What do they need? We don't know. We don't know anything about it. And so we've been able to actually go out and collect the seeds. Now the real work starts. Do they need cold? What do they need to get them growing? So that's what we're working on now. And so a lot of work happening here, and I'm really glossing over a lot of the details, but if you're interested in seeds, you should create a home seed bank, okay? And this is a picture of my home seed bank here. A refrigerator crisper drawer is perfect for storing your seeds. Like I said, and I can tell you, your family will really love this, okay? And so mine is not very well kept, but some of the things, like you can see it says lilium there. Lilies, if you like growing lilies, their seeds easily last for a century or more if you keep them in your refrigerator crisper drawer. A lot of your vegetables, tomatoes and peppers and beans and all those things, ignore that expiration date on the packet. Just keep them in your refrigerator. You can use them for years and years and years. Okay, again, not all seeds can be banked, right? So if you were to take some oak acorns and put them in a bag and put them in your crisper drawer, about December, you're going to pull the bag out and realize they all have roots because they're just going to germinate, okay? And so you can't store everything, but this is a really great way, to take advantage of people like seed exchanges and things like that are out there, different seeds that might be available. You can store them very, very easily. So my last slide, I have 2 slides left, so just some take-home messages. Longwood Gardens is really dedicated to plant conservation, right? There's a recognition that all around the world, plants are endangered or threatened. We're taking big strides to help combat some of what's happening. We're going to continue to expand our efforts, so hopefully you'll come back for more Science Series presentations as more of these roll out and can learn more about what's happening behind the scenes here at Longwood. And we're really dedicated to orchids. So our orchid display room, we've got a great collection there, but hopefully we can start to share some of these things we've propagated with you in different parts of the garden and really, again, using those as an opportunity to tell some of the stories like I'm telling you right now. And we look forward to sharing more of these with you in the future. And I just want to leave you with Longwood Gardens' mission. Longwood Gardens is the living legacy of Pierre Dupont, bringing joy and inspiration to everyone through the beauty of nature, conservation, and learning. So thank you for coming. I know it went a little bit long. I appreciate it. Please enjoy the gardens. And if you have any questions, I think we have some time for that now. Thank you.